Compared to other modern rubbish HBO and the BBC have been putting out of late, Years and Years actually stands out as being fairly decent. It examines the rippling of historical events from the perspective of a middle-class family, whilst painting with broad strokes what the British socio-economic landscape will be like in the next 15 years. The show is largely allegorical through the characterisation of Vivian Rook, alongside the profoundly life-altering events that the family get bombarded by, questioning whether this is the direction we want to be headed in. In this video, I'll be analysing the best and worst of Russell T Davies' highly praised miniseries and ultimately give you my verdict on whether it's worth watching or not. So, without further ado, let's get on with the review. Years and Years has a fairly simple opener to set the pace for the entire series. Many years will be condensed into a few hours, hence the title, but this sequence also reflects the modern tendency to do away with title sequences entirely or keep them brief enough to prevent a skip intro scenario that has come about thanks to online streaming services. Beyond this, we are introduced to our characters, all being totally relatable against the backdrop of 2019 Britain. This is shown through an interview with Vivian Rook, personifying a female Nigel Farage-Donald Trump combination. The tactics of the modern right are identified quickly through Rook's honesty, independence, and being generally provocative to gain online attention. Later on, she would become the Prime Minister, a fairly accurate prediction of Boris Johnson's ascension to that position also. The details of her cabinet aren't laid out very clearly, but it would appear that the intricacies of government and power aren't of real importance to the show, instead perhaps identifying the inevitable downfall of democratic institutions with the rise of technology. It would certainly seem like a bleak prediction, but not improbable. There's certainly more hints towards this idea of tech destroying politics with various events and inventions. One of the most obvious ones is when an MP gets decapitated by a drone, and when Vivian introduces the public to the Blink device. The latter definitely wasn't utilised properly in my opinion, and this stems from its very introduction. Despite Rook possessing and using one, no alarms are raised. She doesn't get arrested, or at the very least disqualified from the race, so that scene ended up feeling like something straight out of a Star Wars prequel.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Vivian Rook also hosts her own TV network, taking the audience's attention away from mainstream outlets. I think it would have been a better idea to have her live streaming online or some kind of crazy progression from that idea, because that's where the young voters go for their information. Online. I mean, how else do you explain her getting so many votes in the election? The antidote to all of this appears in the form of Senior, the central communications hub for the Lyons family. It not only warns of technology's superior utility and intelligence over mankind, but acts as a device of bringing the family together for their well-being. If there's one thing we've found with social media in recent years, is how disconnected people are despite the mass adoption of these platforms by the populace. With a device like Senior, this would appear to be the solution to the siloing of individuals in the modern age, allowing them to reconnect with their families. I definitely think that the character Beth's transformation throughout the series added to this downfall of politics idea too. She was certainly one of the more interesting characters, starting off as a person unable to express herself through human interaction and instead requiring a filter to interact with her parents. This disturbing concept seems like the logical advancement of cellular technology, teenagers riddled with anxiety having a social outlet that seems bewildering to parents runs chills down the spine. In spectacular fashion, things only get worse for Beth from here, as she later uses implants in her hands and her friend would lose an eye from this naive optimism and eagerness towards technology too. This presumably is what leads to all the technology being put into the hands of the government due to its unregulated nature. As happy as many like Beth would be, this runs the risk of a 1984-esque technocracy, shown when Vivian Rook's government siphons off communities for having too much crime. The other caveat to this situation is that Beth essentially becomes government property. This raises a debate of who ultimately holds the keys to this unimaginable power. If the government hold it, then we might see the excess wealth tech companies end up accumulating passing down to the people in the form of basic income, something very sorely needed in a world with growing wealth inequality. On the other hand, this is a rather optimistic view of an institution renowned for being in bed with large business businesses that will likely fund their election campaigns. Tech companies are made up of scientists too, and aren't just eat-and-educated twats that think they know what's best for everyone. What is ultimately proposed by Davies is that technology will become so powerful that it will become its own thing entirely, separate from political and financial grasps. Well, at least I would be on board with the idea had they not delivered the proposal with so much cringe attached.
What are you doing?
You don't own us anymore. We're declaring independence.
Politics certainly plays a key role in Years and Years, but I would say that it's not the primary focus, that being family. We see this notion from the character Daniel's monologue in the first episode, where he worries about everything he sees on TV. One remedy to this would probably be to just simply stop watching the news, but the show makes it abundantly clear that the external forces of the Earth that he is indeed worrying about will have a profound effect on this family unit. We speed through this beautiful montage, skipping 5 years into the future. What's most wonderful about it is the level of plausibility it holds. The Queen dying, Trump's second election, all very bold predictions to keep the audience hooked into finding out what repercussions will come from these events. Sadly, Trump and King Charles don't get much more mention beyond this episode, but the show isn't too caught up on every little event that will inevitably happen in the short-term future, thanks to its focus on this family unit. Throughout the series, we do see more of these montages, playing more to the absurdity factor the further into the future they go, with a fantastic crescendo at the end displaying the Leaning Tower of Pisa finally falling over. Playing underneath the series is Murray Gold's rather unorthodox score that juxtaposes the typical Welsh choral singers and orchestral accompaniments with heavy metal inspired drums smashing away underneath. It's certainly an odd mix, but drives the fast pace of the montages with enough dramatic effect to make them thoroughly exciting. It is also heard with every form of disaster that happens. Unfortunately, it does get a little repetitive as the series goes on, but possibly the most effective use of this music is at the end of the first episode. China gets nuked and suddenly civilization breaks down for one night. The anger and outcry of humanity can be heard in the music and seen in the characters, producing a very tribal and spine-chilling sequence of the family arguing, contrasting with the fiery passion Daniel has for this total stranger. Daniel struck me as a character that played by the rules his entire life, and with the world seemingly coming to an end, for once he's going to do what he wants to. Now that sounds a little rapey, but compared to cowering in fear like the rest of the family, it makes for interesting drama that he chose this path and will inevitably be punished for his love for Victor. This is certainly the most tragic aspect of Daniel's story, and I think this is why the ending of episode 4 packs such a punch to the gut. He plays with fire by choosing Victor over his husband, and this is represented with the ex-husband setting fire to the gazebo, severing the tie with the family. Rather fittingly, Victor gets a job in a petrol station where the ex-husband doesn't set fire to physically, but sets fire to Daniel's life by reporting Victor to the government because of said job. Thus the deportation and immigration issue is presented. Davies seems to be implying in the show that the issue of immigration is never going to disappear and will in fact get worse as the human population multiplies. With a migrant crisis that starts off in the pilot, we see that the UK takes in refugees to the point they're converting shipping containers into accommodation, something that has already happened in Europe in the past few years. Daniel, being a manager of one of these sites, whisks away a woman with no conscience that voted leave and complains that this isn't what she voted for. It would seem from the offset that the show has a specific political leaning, but it later proves to be a lot smarter than that. Vivian Rook suggests on TV that an IQ test should be taken before people vote. Davies definitely seems to be having a jab at the Remain camp also for having this high-minded opinion that people aren't smart enough to make decisions on things like Brexit. He simultaneously supports the notion that the public were ill-informed on the subject and warns not to trust the fear-mongering promises of right-wing politicians.
Your wish is my command. But be careful what you wish for.
Oh, and the offer to make a Father's Day review still stands, by the way. Get me 50 patrons and consider it done. Back on topic though, the squabbles of politics are quashed by the emotional experience Danny and Victor go through as the years go by. Their constant struggle to find a place to exist peacefully comes across as sheer bad luck for them from the start, hopping from one nation to another. Finally, it leads them to attempting a return to the UK, a mission that robs Daniel of all his savings and then his own life. His naive naive assumption that it would be simple to cross the channel with enough money exposes the West's own backward perspective on what refugees go through. These scenes in France were truly brutal, emotional, and super smart too. Western media puts out seemingly endless reports of bodies washing up on European shores, which makes us almost numb to the notion that there are real human beings fighting for their lives in these photographs. It's like that saying, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Daniel's repeating of the phrase, "it's only 20 miles, reflects this naivety, and by having one of the key family members die to something that is commonly associated with foreigners, drives this issue home, giving the audience a wake-up call to the very real and deadly issue that humanity will be dealing with today, tomorrow, and beyond. So we've discussed one brother, Daniel, and now on to the next. Stephen. He and his immediate family have one of the most dramatic story arcs of the show, and it's honestly the one that seemed the most grounded in reality too. Well, apart from his daughter, of course. The bank's collapsing starts it off as this cosmopolitan couple get reduced to poverty. Both Tania Miller and Rory Kinnear perform these characters beautifully, being these snobs that are forced to live with the grandmother that Celeste will go from loathing to loving by the end. Despite leaping into the future, history is still evidently capable of repeating itself by having yet another financial meltdown. What struck me the most about this sequence was that moment when a police officer's bank gets closed right after Stephen's, and was in fact one of the men initially hired to stop people from going in. It is tempting to laugh at Stephen's downfall, as befits his title as the man who lost £1 million, but when contrasted with this angry police officer, this depression affects everyone, making it all the more relatable. By doing this, Davies asks how it's fair that whole nations of people work for a system that could collapse at any moment, and why we continue to allow banks to rule over the security of people's lives. The aftermath of the recession leads Stephen to take on the job of a cyclist delivering parcels. With companies run into the ground also, he receives the worst wage imaginable and has to pay them insurance just to remain employed. The bitterness, resentment, and shame builds up to the point that he turns, for lack of a better term, to the dark side, seen firsthand when he runs over a delivery bike. At first I was a bit annoyed at him doing this, but it clicked on a second viewing why this moment at the halfway mark in the series was so pivotal. I noticed that there wasn't a picture of the father at the funeral the siblings attend, representing him more as this evil hereditary force that will engulf Stephen, almost passing on the torch to his son, if you will. After the funeral, the characters sit at the pub and Stephen is the only one not crying. He shares the occupation with his father's killer, and this act of defiance displays no means of redemption for him. It certainly seemed a little odd though that none of his family sat in the car with him complained about what he was doing, and I was a little disappointed they used that same piece of music heard at the end of the first 2 episodes as well. But what happens afterwards was peak drama to me. Celeste confronting Stephen about the affair in front of their children and Muriel was fantastic. Not only do Kinnear and Miller absolutely kill it in these scenes, but the Nan twisting the knife in about Stephen being as bad as his father and throwing him out was just exceptional. It felt so rewarding to watch him get what he deserved, but to then witness him conceptualizing being kicked out by his mistress for the first hour of every morning was wonderful too. Sadly, however, the death of Daniel leaves Stephen in an embittered state that I don't think was handled particularly well. This obsession with finding a little bit of cheese in the fridge is relatable for anybody who's dealt with grief, but I found it laughable that this shot just kept on being repeated. It's shown 3 times in episode 5, and his anger only gets more laughable as the story unfolded. With everything that happens to Stephen, I can totally understand why he would take it all out on Victor. His irrational blaming can only get him so far though, because in no time at all, he's suddenly working for Vivian Rook's government. This may have been more nods to how the Weimar Republic in Germany fell in 1933, being taken over by bitter and resentful people, but the way he's able to deport Victor on this overly simplistic software just felt totally unbelievable. And don't get me started on that scene with the gun. Oh, shut up, you big baby. Christ, let's just talk about another sibling. Oh, Rosie. A character and actress with spina bifida that maintains her independence with a fiery personality. She supports Vivian Rook not for her policies, but for being an outcast like herself. Unfortunately, all of this gets thrown back at her when her own neighborhood gets ring-fenced, a symptom of Rook's premiership. Sadly, this is where the good stuff relating to her stops, because her tale getting a food van pales in significance compared to the grander narratives of her government-toppling siblings. She becomes an afterthought, not for making a stand, but because Davies' solution to her problem is exactly the same as Rose's at the end of Parting of the Ways. Just use a big truck! You could almost smell it coming from the moment she buys it. I wasn't a particularly big fan of Edith, in all honesty, either. I mean, sure, everyone needs an anarchist in their lives to tell us all why we shouldn't trust the government, but surely this would have been obvious from what happens in the show anyway. There seems to be an underlying critique of her ideology, though, because of her inconsistencies. Take her yearning to do something with her life other than shouting in episode 2 because of her lifespan, and ends up shouting at people to get their phones out and start filming everything in the finale. I just think she would have been better characterized as a dangerous anarchist consistently. I only suggest this because the moment when she holds a knife to John Joe's throat was unexpected and dramatic. Brilliant, in fact. However, the sequence where she gets some company taken down because she just had a magical smartphone trick up her sleeve was just totally inconsequential. The grandmother, Muriel, I was a bit hit and miss with too. I mean, firstly, how the hell isn't she dead from all these years passing by? After throwing Stephen out, she gives a rather provocative speech about the state of existence. For her, efficiency and affordability have actually made the world worse. For sure, it's easier to complain about the world instead of actively seeking solutions, but how much exactly a person can do is in question because of how much is already rigged against them from the start. She appears to be yearning for her grandchildren to be heroes, as they will turn out to be in the finale, but it appeared to me that she was addressing the audience as much as her family. Whichever crooked ideology is in charge, there must never be a failure on the part of individuals to identify and solve the problems of this world. Otherwise, we perpetually spin the wheel of life, condemned to repeat ourselves for eternity. Or something along those lines. I wouldn't be too swayed by the ramblings of this old lady though, considering how selfish she turns around to be when she gets her eyesight back. With Rook's introduction of a bedroom law, all the homeless must be housed by those with a spare bedroom. Sounds fair in theory, but in practice it proves more difficult for those who actually have to sort out the logistics of it all. A man comes and visits Muriel and the whole rehousing issue just gets thrown under the rug because she's going blind. Her reaction is totally believable for a 90-something woman, but Muriel losing her sight shifts the focus away from homelessness and towards a criticism of the NHS and privatisation above all else. Sure, it's funny that there's an NHS fast track of £10,000, but it struck me as a fairly odd snap decision to prevent her children from having any of her inheritance. I could totally get on board with this happening if it had some payoff. One dramatic thing they could have done was having a clash with Rosie, perhaps. If we are to assume that in the future these miracle treatments are going to become a reality, you would think Rosie would maybe like the prospect of being cured with something that would have hindered her for her entire existence. I know I'm smashing the what if button a little too hard here, but I thought the fact that there's no conflict arisen from this event whatsoever was a seriously missed opportunity. And then we get to the ending. Oh golly. If I said earlier on the show's emphasis on family supersedes all else, in the finale this is completely reversed and then reinstated by the end. We start off at the camp where Victor's been relocated. He recognises some rando that is on the other side of the camp. Victor expresses concern that this bloke might spread his illness to the children on his side, and then that concern just vanishes for seemingly no reason. Well done, idiot, you just spread the virus to you and by proxy everyone else. For all we know, this guy might have been the man that told Victor about the woman in France that nabbed $6,000 off them in episode 4. Then Victor says this.
So they seal us off, and then they bring in the infection and let it spread. I think it's very British.
What the bloody hell is British about that? I mean, unless you knew about that very specific aspect of South African history that Vivian Rook just happened to be discussing in the previous episode. Oh, but wait, you weren't. So why would you say that? In Edith and Fran's house, they plot their rescue of Victor with two characters I honestly thought were just two random people. Initially, I thought they were homeless and had been taken in after the bedroom law was implemented, but it turns out that this woman here is the woman who couldn't do anything to keep Victor in the UK, and I even had to jump back to episode 2 to confirm this, and this other person is a random guy called Ahmed. He is just a man with an RPG, leaving any motivation or origin to his character completely amiss. I mean, Christ, how do you even get one of those things? Then, after another cringy statement from Edith,
We didn't just come here to save you. We came here to start a war.
the rescue just becomes a bit of a shit show. What was the point in establishing the blink as Vivian's weapon of choice and then having it harnessed to a broadcasting tower? Why not just give all the soldiers blinks to prevent this sort of thing from happening? One of which appears to be played by Jodie Whittaker. By this point in the story, the 4-star party have become renowned for being the champions of secrecy and censorship, and it all just falls apart because of an oversight. I actually really liked that on Rosie's side of the fence, again, no pun intended, everyone was filming because it really does make the security look bad. It probably would have made the end of Rosie's story more unique as well had the Victor rescue not relied on the same use your phone's exit strategy. Beyond that though, we have this very strange epilogue scene. What a great way to elongate a story that has already been stretched thin by the end. It's so abstract that I can't even grasp my head around what's going on anymore. Maybe that's the point of it, but Edith suddenly becomes this angelic figure elevated to a point of high recognition, and yet she has to sit and explain to these two randos all that happened to her. At least one of the pair has an English accent, so how did she not live through all of it herself, or even watch the footage that supposedly everybody was made to watch on that day? Don't get me wrong, there are a couple of details I liked about this ending. For one thing, it was foreshadowed by 2 prior events. The first was in episode 2 when Beth says to Edith,
Did you know you can live forever?
the other was at the funeral when the father gets acclimated, and in the same spirit, Edith lives on inside water molecules too. In between this transfer, we see footage of Stephen coming over from prison to cry over some more cheese. See Edith in her dying moments. Fortunately, the show leaves us on a more positive note, that of a rather ambiguous ending. Edith says that she is now love. Her statement symbolizes the love the family share, for she is now going to be integrated with Signor, another symbol of the family's unity. The family are shown sitting around the device that has brought them together so many times throughout the series for one last time. From here, the future will become so unrecognizable from our own reality that trying to encapsulate it on film would be too alienating for the audience. Well, at least that's what I think Russell was going for, and he has confirmed that this is definitely the end of the show. And by the way, bravo for doing so, sir. If there was one thing that rubs me up the wrong way about TV shows is when they tease for another season. I definitely say Years and Years is worth watching. Just don't go in with the highest expectations and you might enjoy it more than I did. I might have been a bit mean to the show as well, but as I say, it's decent TV and I honestly can't wait to check out Queer as Folk when I get the chance. Oh yeah, and those Chucklevision episodes Russell wrote in the 90s too.
That's ridiculous. Oh, it's stupid. Who wants to watch this?
Thanks for watching. Do you reckon Trump's gonna get a second term in office like this show predicts? Comment below your thoughts or discuss with us on the Discord server, where we will continue this discussion.